For years, analysts warned of a new axis of evil: Russia, China, Iran, three powers converging against the American-led order. When the US struck Iran, some predicted World War III. Russia would have no choice, they said. The axis would hold. It didn't. Russia has helped Iran covertly, carefully, and just enough to serve Moscow's own interests. But the troops aren't coming, the missiles aren't coming, and understanding why tells you more about this relationship than a decade of axis of evil headlines ever did. I'm Bruce Pannier. I've spent 4 decades covering the former Soviet Union. This is Turan Research Center, hosted by the Yorktown Institute, where we cover developments in Iran, Turkey, Central Asia, and the South Caucasus. If you're new here and want more analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's get into it.
Уважаемый господин Рухани.
To understand why Russia stood aside, you first have to understand what Russia-Iran relationship actually is, because it has been almost universally misread. Journalist Nikita Smagin spent years covering Iran as a correspondent for TASS, the Russian state news agency. He's the author of the Turan Research Center analysis this video is based on, and of the book Iran for Everyone. And what he found living inside that relationship was something that almost no Western analyst has adequately captured. Russia and Iran do not like each other.
Iranians generally, their attitude towards Russia is actually very bad, I may say. They see Russia as a colonial power or imperialistic power that tries to get Iranian resources, Iranian territory, and there is a certain level, a certain number of historical moments that still are, causes some kind of bad feelings about Russia.
The history explains a lot. Peter the Great launched a military campaign into Persia in the 18th century and seized vast territories: Derbent, Baku, the northern Caspian coast. A century later, the two Russo-Persian wars ended with Iran permanently losing what is now Azerbaijan. The peace treaties that followed, Gulistan and Turkmenchai, are not forgotten in Tehran. The word Turkmenchai entered the Persian language as a byword for a humiliating imposed peace. As recently as 2022, a former head of Iran's central bank used the word Turkmenchai to describe interest rates Russia tried to impose on Iranian grain imports. 200 years later, the wound hasn't healed. In 1941, the Soviet Union and Britain jointly occupied Iran, forced the Shah to abdicate, and used Iranian territory as a logistics corridor. Iranians remember it not as a liberation, but as an occupation by foreign powers, one of whom was Russia. After the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini left no ambiguity. America was the great Satan, but the Soviet Union, he said, was the lesser Satan, a different Satan, not a friend. Moscow backed Baghdad in the Iran-Iraq War and largely ignored Tehran throughout the 1990s. It was only after relations with the West collapsed and Syria pulled the two countries into the same conflict that any real partnership emerged. Smagin described the texture of the relationship from the inside.
Iranian diplomats sometimes can say something like that we really know what you are intended to do in our country and we don't trust you and so on. So there is this kind of thing that Iranian side thinks that Russia wants to influence the situation in Iran and they don't like it. They want to prevent Russia from doing it, but at the same time, as I said, they have no choice but to develop relations with Russia.
When Moscow briefly used an Iranian airbase in 2016 to launch airstrikes in Syria, the backlash inside Iran was immediate. Iranian politicians and social media erupted. How dare Russia put troops on Iranian soil? Like every other foreign power in history that has tried to dominate us. Tehran reversed the agreement within a week. The Russian ambassador to Tehran, speaking to Smagin, after reading an article arguing that Russia and Iran were not allies, agreed with the article's conclusion.
He actually said to me that actually you're right, that we're not friends, we're fellow travelers. So we're now here because we need each other, and we will follow this path together until we need each other, but not after that.
What Russia and Iran actually share is a shared list of enemies, which is a very different thing. Here's what the history tells us. The partnership is driven entirely by circumstances. When external pressure eases, the grievances and the competition come back.
Iran depends on Russia in some very important issues, but again, it is not that Iran cannot exist and subsist without Russia. I think it is very important to outline it so that no one gets a false impression that all Iran's survival or Russia's war in Ukraine is because of Iran. It is important, but it is not very important.
В общем, достаточно активно идет работа практически по всем направлениям.
Whatever the underlying tensions, Russia spent years carefully building an economic presence inside Iran, because whatever Moscow thought of Tehran, Iran was strategically useful.
So generally, while saying all the things, while being, having all these not always good views of Russia, they're trying to be realistic, and in this regard, they just have no choice but to talk, to cooperate with Russia, to ask them for some support. And Russia, almost the same thing. They are doing this not because they like Iran, but because they think that it's in Russians' favor to have some good relations with Iran, at least for now.
Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, was constructing new reactor units at the Bashir power plant. Russian specialists were at work at the Syrik thermal power plant in Hormozgan province. Russian companies held stakes in at least 5 oil fields, and there was the bigger prize, the North-South Transport Corridor.
То, что мы успешно взаимодействуем в рамках столь крупного проекта, отражает высокий уровень, плодотворный, взаимовыгодный характер российско-иранских отношений.
With Russia cut off from its traditional European transit routes after 2022, a railway running from Russia through Azerbaijan and into Iran and eventually to the Persian Gulf became a strategic necessity. Moscow pledged $1.5 billion to build the Rashta-Stara rail link, the missing piece connecting the two countries' railway networks. That's a significant portfolio, but not out of friendship, but out of calculation. Iran was sanctioned, isolated, and had every incentive to keep its deals with Moscow. And now almost all of it is frozen. Rosatom suspended construction at Bashir after explosions hit within kilometers of the facility.
Мы решительно осуждаем безответственный, абсолютно неприемлемый ракетный удар, нанесенный по внутреннему периметру атомной электростанции Бушер.
The Russian consulate in Isfahan was damaged by strikes on March 8th. The fate of the Syrik plant and the oil field operations remained unclear. And the North-South Corridor, already questioned on profitability grounds, now faces what Smogin calls conditions that make its completion effectively out of reach. The calculation that makes Iran economically useful to Russia assumed a baseline of stability. The war has eliminated that baseline.
Russia can see that things are not going in a really bad direction, at least for now, because there are still some losses, but also some opportunities for Russia, and Russia is trying to wait and see. Maybe they can really get something even more from it. Of course, the most important thing is connected with oil prices and natural gas prices. The instability in the region of Persian Gulf will continue for some time, and this will push the oil prices up, and of course this is in favor of Russia.
With the Strait of Hormuz functionally closed and Middle Eastern supply disrupted, Brent crude has surged past $100 a barrel, up from $73 a barrel the day before the war began. Russia's daily oil revenue this month is running 14% higher than in February. That is a direct windfall for the Russian budget, potentially enough to offset significant sanctions pressure for the rest of the year. And here's the part that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. The West is already starting to bend. On March 14th, the U.S. Treasury announced a 30-day exemption on sanctions for Russian oil already loaded onto tankers, roughly 125 million barrels. The administration framed it as a narrow measure to stabilize markets. Ukrainian President Zelensky called it a potential $10 billion gift to Russia's war machine. Days earlier, Putin went further. He publicly offered to resume oil and gas deliveries to Europe on the condition that European buyers commit to long-term, stable cooperation free from political pressure. In other words, drop the sanctions posture and the taps reopen.
Иных сигналов мы не получали от европейцев. С другой стороны, никогда не поздно. Вы знаете, что президент Путин открыт конструктивному диалогу и открыт к обсуждению самых острых вопросов за столом переговоров.
6 of the 7 G7 leaders told Trump that this was the wrong signal. But the offer is on the table, and the longer the Hormuz stays closed, the harder it becomes to refuse. There's a structural benefit too. China depends heavily on Middle Eastern energy. The war is teaching Beijing a lesson. The Middle East is not a reliable supply source.
So generally, I think that it will push China, firstly, of course, towards getting more oil and gas from Russia. But not only this, they will try to limit cooperation with the Middle Eastern countries, because I think that this conflict would be a very vivid example for them, because they don't want to be dependent on such a conflicts in future.
India, meanwhile, was already resisting U.S. pressure to reduce Russian oil imports. That resistance becomes easier to sustain when Middle East supply is visibly at risk. And then there's Ukraine. The United States is deploying weapon stocks, including Patriot interceptors Ukraine depends on, against Iranian targets. What is consumed in the Middle East is not available in Eastern Europe. Washington's diplomatic bandwidth has shifted with it. Trump has suggested postponing this meeting with Xi Jinping because Iran has overtaken China on the agenda. Ukraine, which was already struggling for attention, is now competing with a full-scale Middle Eastern war for American focus, American weapons, and American political will. For Moscow, that might be the most valuable gain of all. Not a single extra ruble, but a distracted superpower.
They are distracting on the media level attention from Ukraine, but I don't think it is very important because nothing strategic is unfolding on Ukraine, because the situation in Ukraine has not changed because of the Iran war. The situation in Ukraine remains static because the main problem of Ukraine remains the same. It is a lack of human resources. This is the main problem of Ukraine. And all the other is like, it depends indeed on what the media say.
Then there's what happens to Iran if it survives this war. Iran strikes have hit UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain. Countries that were not outright enemies of Tehran are now deeply hostile. A battered, isolated Iran emerging from this conflict will have fewer partners than it entered with. Russia, as a supplier of weapons and grain with no interest in complying with Western sanctions, could find itself with more leverage over a post-war Tehran than it held before, not because the relationship has improved, but because Iran's options will have narrowed. Now here's where it gets more complicated, because Russia has not sat there doing nothing. According to CNN and the Washington Post, citing multiple U.S. intelligence sources, Russia has been sharing targeting intelligence with Iran, satellite imagery showing the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft. Several Iranian drones have struck locations where the U.S. forces were present. Whether Russian intelligence directly enabled those strikes is unclear, but the intelligence sharing itself is confirmed. A U.S. source described it as showing that Russia still likes Iran very much. That framing is wrong. What it actually shows is that Russia sees a cold interest in bleeding American military resources in the Middle East, slowing deployment, consuming weapon stocks, distracting Washington from Ukraine. Iran is the instrument. The target is the United States. Russia isn't helping Iran survive, it's helping Iran bleed America.
Don't listen to the noise. Just stay focused.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, asked directly about Russian involvement, called Moscow and Beijing not really a factor. Not a denial, a deliberate downgrade. Washington has calculated that calling out Russia's covert assistance would require a response it doesn't want to give right now.
Russia does not belong to the same category as America. For example, Russia has no economic weight. It cannot compete with America. It's just a local bully. It's like a local bully for America because they want, but they cannot. China is altogether different, but not because China hates America or America hates China, but because of economic weight of China. Every country that China enters there, it is like the Soviet army. It liberated, but it forgot to live. This is a problem. Not that China is bad or like it's not a terrorist state. Like, and of course Russia does not organize the terrorist attacks across the world like Iran does.
Moscow, for its part, has stayed precisely calibrated. Do enough to hurt American interests at the margins. Risk nothing that could draw Russia into a fight it didn't choose over a partner it doesn't trust.
They're definitely not allies. As I said, they not even friends, I may say. They don't have even friendly relations, actually. They have very pragmatic cooperation, and we can say that they are strategic partners. This is most likely true, I guess. But at the same time, it's all about pragmatism, and when Russia won't need Iran, for example, it can move some other direction. We don't see this possibility, at least for now, but in future it's possible.
Add it all up, and something more troubling comes into view than any single project or commodity price. Russia spent years building a strategic architecture in the Middle East, Syria, Iran, a role as indispensable broker. That architecture gave Moscow the one thing it prizes above almost everything, the ability to shape events. Trump strikes are dismantling it, not because Russia is the target, but because events are moving at a scale and speed Moscow cannot manage.
Russia is losing its strategy in the Middle East because Iran was considered as one of the most important partners and one of the most important directions of Russian policy in the Middle East. Iran was considered as a territory that can be used to get additional access to world markets. I mean, there was the idea of a gas hub, natural gas hub. Almost the same idea was about north-south transport corridor. Russia was trying and is still trying to find additional routes for the goods transit. And we can say that now both projects are impossible, at least in the foreseeable future.
Assad's Syria already fell. If Iran falls, Russia loses its last major partner along the entire southern arc from the Mediterranean to the Caspian. And if the Islamic Republic survives, it won't be the same partner Moscow had before. It will be weaker, more isolated, and more dependent on Russia than at any point since the relationship began. Before this war, Iran had options. It could play Moscow against Beijing, it could leverage its position in the Gulf to extract concessions, it could push back, and it did. Post-war Iran, battered by American and Israeli strikes, cut off from half the region by its own retaliatory attacks, facing a leadership transition, loses that leverage. Russia becomes not a partner of choice, but a partner of last resort. And Moscow knows exactly how to exploit a dependent partner. And there are already signs of what this dependency looks like in practice. In mid-March, Kuwaiti media reported Mojtaba Khamenei, severely injured in the strike that killed his father, was flown to Moscow on a Russian military plane after Putin personally offered medical treatment. The Kremlin declined to comment, but if true, the symbolism is hard to miss. The new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic recovering in a Russian hospital in the same city where Assad fled after his regime collapsed in Syria. That's not partnership, that's patronage. So one scenario is that Russia actually tightens its grip on Tehran, but that's not the same as gaining influence in the region. It's managing a diminished asset in a neighborhood where Moscow no longer sets the terms.
Russia is losing its influence, and Russia is losing its image as a really strong country that can change the dynamic of the region. They are fully aware of them losing control of the situation and that they are not considered as a military power anymore in the region. This is why they're trying to find some new ways of cooperating with the countries and some new ways to present, to reshape their image.
Because the broader picture hasn't changed, Russia's infrastructure investments are frozen. Its transit corridor is out of reach. Its role as regional broker has been erased by U.S. operation it had no power to prevent. The scenario in which Russia emerges as a net winner requires a lot of things going right simultaneously. Oil prices hold. China pivots to Russian pipelines. Iran survives and becomes dependent on Moscow. And the conflict stays contained. It's possible, but it depends on circumstances Russia cannot control. And beneath all of this is the question Smogin raised most sharply. Not about profits and losses, but about agency. Russia might find itself, for the first time in years, only able to react in the region that it is invested heavily in. Unable to shape events, unable to be consulted, just watching. For a country whose entire strategic identity is built on being indispensable, that may be the most consequential loss of all.
So it's still a legitimate player. It's still a player that have some cooperation, some relations with some countries, and even in some cases like Turkey or Egypt, the level of trading is increasing. At the same time, fall of Bashar Assad. Now Iran shows to the local countries that Russia is not a country that changes the dynamics. It's just a spectator, and the only thing that they can do is to, trade, sell grains, maybe provide some countries with some nuclear technologies, built-in nuclear plants, and almost that's it. Almost that's it.
The axis of evil narrative was always more comfortable than accurate. It imagined three countries converging toward a common purpose, held together by shared ideology and mutual commitment. What Russia and Iran actually share is a list of enemies, a history of mutual exploitation, and a partnership that has always been a transaction, never a bond. Moscow will share satellite imagery. It will not share the risk. It will benefit from higher oil prices. It will not rebuild what Iran is losing. And when this war ends, however it ends, Russia and Iran will sit across from each other with the same competing interest and the same cold calculation about whether the other is still useful. That's not an alliance. It never was. This video is based on analysis by Nikita Smagin for the Turan Research Center. The link is in the description, along with his book, Iran for Everyone. Let me know in the comments, do you think Russia comes out of this war stronger, or has it lost something in the Middle East it can't get back? Thanks for watching. I'm Bruce Paneer. Subscribe for more.